Rafal Betlejewski of Polish Radio RDC in Warsaw, Poland. This is my Skype conversation with Mr. Jared Genser, Harvard lawyer and peace activist, who is working closely with Mr. Xiaobo, Peace Nobel Prize laureate, and his wife. I reached him in London on the 15th October 2013. Hello, could you tell me what's going on with Lucia Bo and his wife at the moment?
Well, I think it's a terrible and tragic situation and a very, very challenging one to unravel. Ultimately, after being the lead signatory on Charter 08, which of course was modeled on Czechoslovakia's Charter 77,
yes.
He was convicted and sentenced to 11 years in prison for charges of inciting subversion. This was actually on Christmas Day in 2009. And so he has an 11-year prison sentence. He was announced, of course, as the recipient of the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize in October 2010. And within a week, his wife, Lucia, who I had been working with very closely over a number of months when I got involved in the case before she herself was put under house arrest. She herself, was detained about a week later. And Lucia has been under a rather strict form of house arrest over the last 3+ years. She's, basically not able to receive any visitors. She has no internet access, and she has no access to incoming or outgoing mail. No phone, no mail, and no internet. She cannot leave the house. She's been taken out of the house on a number of occasions. On a monthly basis, she's able to see Lucia Bo in prison. This is what's been reported. She also receives food deliveries from the Chinese government, and she makes a grocery list, and food is delivered to her. But there's literally a Chinese security official posted outside of her home. Outside of her apartment, in her apartment building, and there are about a half dozen Chinese security officials at the front entrance to the apartment building itself, making it impossible to see her. There have been a handful of occasions, literally you can count them on one hand, like 3 or 4, where because of changes in the guard shifts, one friend was able to get to her front door, and there was some video captured of her very tearful and upset. A foreign diplomat or two has made it in at a couple of different times. 99% of attempts to see her fail because people are just turned away at the front entrance. What makes this nightmare, really particularly, Kafkaesque is the fact that the Chinese government publicly and privately claims that she's under no legal restriction. So they claim that she's actually not under any house arrest or, in fact, any form of legal detention.
How is this lie possible? Who believes it?
I don't think anyone believes it. I think that, unfortunately, and this is why I said unraveling the situation is very difficult. Unfortunately, in my experience, working on this case now for 3 years, and I'll note that previously I spent 5 years representing Aung San Suu Kyi of Burma while she was in her latter term of imprisonment under house arrest in Burma. The reality is very few governments around the world are prepared to really take on China. And even the United States, the UK, and France, the 3 permanent members of the Security Council that would be most theoretically interested in helping, have been very muted in their criticism of the Chinese government. So, President Obama, we asked him to sign on to a letter that we were able to arrange from 134 Nobel laureates across the 6 Nobel disciplines to go to Xi Jinping as the incoming Chinese president, and President Obama declined to sign on to that letter. The White House and President Obama has never publicly called for Lucia's release from house arrest. And so, unfortunately, the situation is such that the Chinese government not only lies, but nobody is willing to even publicly challenge their version of events. Now, the UN, in our submission that we made on behalf of Lucia Bo and his wife Lucia, noted the Chinese government's arguments in that process and dismissed them and said that, widespread media reports confirm she's being detained illegally. And so in that sense, the UN has spoken in a strong voice that, both he and her are detained in violation of international law.
Where is Lucia Bo at this moment?
He's in prison in Beijing and is in solitary confinement at this point. He was moved into solitary confinement after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. But probably it's correct that was not the worst move because, practically speaking, of course, the moment he won the prize, if you were a disgruntled prisoner in the Chinese prison system, one way you could easily get at the Chinese government was by physically hurting him. So he's been he's been detained in solitary confinement for 3 years and counting.
How such a prison looks like? Do you know?
This is a state security prison where you would have some political prisoners that would typically be in different parts of the prison and under more isolation, and then a general prison population as well. He's not in a prison that's exclusively for political dissidents. Typically, they want to spread the political dissidents out across the country rather than gathering them under one roof, kind of knowing the historical experience in places like Poland and others. So as a result, the Chinese, spread them out. So he is, he and she are in a terrible situation. Her brother has been convicted of so-called economic crimes. Again, this is a pretextual charge to bring further pressure onto the family. And, in China today, not only do they persecute the dissidents themselves, but they will go after their lawyers and their families. And I mean, I think that this is the most disturbing aspect of the way that the Chinese government demonstrates the fear that it faces of its own population. Today in China, for the last 3 years, they have expended more than $130 billion annually, which is more than their national security budget on their domestic security budget, right? $130 billion US dollars a year. I mean, that is a staggering sum of money. And this is to literally, hire and staff millions of people monitoring the internet, monitoring telephone calls, and engaging in a whole range of activities to look after every person that they are concerned about. And in a country of 1.3 billion people, there are a lot of people to be worried about because, in China today, there are also more than 120,000 protests that take place across the country each year. Now, to be clear, these are not political protests explicitly. These are protests on much more bread and butter economic issues like, land seizures without compensation or the placement of a coal-fired plant in a major city without consulting the local population or local corruption or environmental pollution of various sorts, right? And so the Chinese government feels a great burden to maintain their staggering economic growth, because as long as people feel their lives are better today than they were yesterday, many people will probably be okay with, heightened political repression. But of course, if their economic miracle starts to falter, then it becomes a much bigger challenge to hold the whole thing together.
Please tell us now, what happened to Lucia Xia's brother?
He was given a 10-year prison term himself for so-called economic crimes. Lucia was, the first time she'd been seen in public for more than 3 years, she was taken to the prison. This was earlier this year, this past April. She was taken to the court and was able to observe her brother's trial. And, she was asked the question, she was ushered out by Chinese security officials back to her car. And she was asked by, Chinese... by media that were kind of yelling after her, what do you have to say? And all she had the time to say was, tell people I'm not free. And then she said, as she was getting into the car and the door was being closed, is it a crime today in China to be Lucia Bo's wife? And of course, we all know the answer is yes. In fact, as far as I know, she's the only person in the world today who is in prison for no other reason than for being married to a Nobel laureate. It's interesting. I was able to have a number of conversations with her before she was detained in the run-up to the Nobel, Peace Prize announcement. And we discussed actually pretty extensively the question of what might happen if he won the prize, because I had begun representing him a few months before he won the prize, and there was already talk that he was on the short list. And, I told her the story of the Soviet dissident Natan Sharansky, whose wife married him and literally the same day was forced to leave the Soviet Union and go into exile. And ultimately she resettled in Israel. And she spent, a decade traveling the world, meeting with President Reagan and a whole range of leaders around the world, all to press for her husband's freedom. And, I explained to Lucia, that there's no right answer here for what she should do. There's really what the right answer is for her. I said that was one model where, it was very powerful to be able to have the spouse of the detainee, who became a very prominent dissident in the Soviet Union, traveling the world and advocating on his behalf. And, Lucia was very candid with me that, China was her home. She loved her country. Her husband did as well. And she couldn't ever imagine a world in which she would have to leave him behind. And so she said she understood the possibility that she would be detained. We discussed very clearly the problem that once he were to win the prize, if that were to happen, then practically speaking, there's no way they could allow the wife of a Nobel Peace Prize laureate to, be free and to be free to meet with journalists and and diplomats, because every word she said would be newsworthy. And she understood that reality, at least in an intellectual sense. I'm not sure she understood exactly how hard this would be on her personally. I mean, I can't imagine living a life day after day after day, 3 years and counting, where, you are literally cut off from the outside world. The Chinese government has also come down on her family because they want to send the message to other dissidents. We can act with impunity. Look at what we can do to someone like Lucia Bo, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and his family. And so if you're some lesser person than that, imagine what we can do to you in the shadows of our state security system.
Have you ever been to Chinese court? Have you seen it?
I've been to a Chinese courthouse. I've never been to a security trial. And the reason, of course, is because these are all closed trials, closed from the media, closed from outside observers. Lucia Bo was sentenced in one of these security courts as well, as was Lucia's brother. And so it's not possible to have access or to observe what happens there.
Okay, but do you know how these proceedings look like?
Yes, I do have a pretty good sense, actually, of what it looks like from descriptions that I've heard from many dissidents over many years, as well as understanding a little bit about what Lucia Bo's trial was like. And in essence, it is a closed courtroom. So you'll literally have, the defendant, let's say Lucia Bo, and his lawyer on one side, and you'll have usually several prosecutors on the other side, and you'll have a single judge, and you'll have, a bailiff, a court guard, as well as, probably several of them as well. And, the evidence, so-called, against Lucia Bo was a number of his writings, including Charter 08. Now, I mean, he was not the sole author of Charter 08. There were many, many dissidents who contributed to Charter 08, which was a platform for a democratic reform of China. And interestingly, the Chinese are more threatened by Lucia Bo because it wasn't that he was calling for taking down the entire system. He was talking about how do you reform the system from within, and that is even more threatening to the Chinese government than tearing down the system, because given the economic realities in China and the this extraordinary rates of growth, most people in the country don't want to just throw out the government overnight, because chaos and anarchy would not serve their economic interests. However, that doesn't mean that people don't want to see something quite different than the one-party system, where there can be accountability and good governance and less corruption, etc. Ultimately, the crime that he was convicted of was subversion, and this is one of those, and I know you have lots of experience in Poland under Soviet occupation with these kinds of laws. These are overbroad national security statutes designed to be impossible to contest. And, the argument was that Charter 08 and the range of other, and another half dozen, articles that he had written were subverting Chinese state control. And of course, his argument in court was, I'm exercising my right to freedom of expression as guaranteed under the Chinese Constitution and treaties signed by the Chinese government, international treaties. And of course, what I'm doing is not subverting the government, but I'm a patriot and I love my country and I'd like to improve my government. But it was summary evidence provided by police as witnesses who recounted what was said, and the judge ultimately, in interpreting this overbroad national security statute, felt no issue with just summarily convicting him. Obviously, the Chinese judiciary is neither independent nor impartial.
Okay, tell us more about who is the judge in a case like this. Is he just a communist representative?
In order to be a judge in China, you have to be, a member of the Communist Party, and you have to be very tightly controlled and controllable. And, in these kinds of sensitive national security cases, not a single move is made without consulting with the Chinese Communist Party, and these decisions are made by senior officials. The reports suggest, and how accurate they are, it's hard to tell, but the reports suggest that this was a personal decision of former Chinese President Hu Jintao, who came after Lucia Bo himself, because although Lucia Bo is only one of a number of authors of Charter 08, Lucia Bo agreed to have himself listed as the first signatory on this petition, which ultimately attracted thousands of Chinese supporters and Chinese people inside and outside China. Lucia Bo was explicitly targeted for Charter 08 because he was the first signatory, and as Hu Jintao said it, allegedly, we need to cut off the head of the snake. And Lucia Bo was, the proverbial head of the snake, because he was signatory number one, who was meant to exemplify what the movement stood for. And, he was a prominent professor, a well-liked professor back in Tiananmen Square in 1989, and led a hunger protest in Tiananmen Square as a professor in support of the students inside Tiananmen Square. And so for him, it was Tiananmen Square which singed in his memory the terrible realities of the one-party system and the repression that can come from a system that doesn't have any mechanisms for justice and accountability. And it was really Charter 08 which spurred his thinking as a political theorist as to the kinds of changes that might be necessary in order to bring, China into the 21st century.
Tell us more about the political system in China. Who really holds the power?
So, it's interesting. From the outside, it's very opaque in certain respects. In other respects, not so much. It's opaque because it's definitely a mistake to say, oh, well, Xi Jinping is the president, he's really in charge. There's a central committee consisting of seven members of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese model is on the one hand, it's interesting. It's, meritocratic. And by that, I mean, the people who end up in the senior leadership of the Chinese Communist Party tend to be exceptionally smart and talented from an academic standpoint. They tend to be more math and science oriented, engineering degrees, less management or business experience, but a lot more hard sciences. And they're able to govern within a range of perspectives, as leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. But, there's the central committee, which makes, primary high-level decisions, typically by consensus, albeit, the president is the facilitator of the consensus-making process. There's a National People's Congress, which has, 700 or 800 members. But again, these are rubber stamp institutions that, follow the dictates provided to them by the Central Committee and, and a broader committee of luminaries in the party. There is an integration, you would say, of control between the executive and the legislative branches of government. They are technically separate branches of government under the Constitution, but practically speaking, the legislature is a rubber stamp for the executive. So practically speaking, they are the same. And the judicial system, again, while it says under the Constitution, is independent. Probably it's fair to say for less sensitive cases, they're not given instructions, clear or otherwise, and as a result, they can just do their jobs. But of course, they always are doing this under the watchful eye of the Chinese Communist Party and the executive branch. So at any time, the executive branch of the Chinese government can come in and tell a judge what to do, and this is how it works in reality for dissidents. There was an interesting example of the case I was mentioning earlier of Yang Zhenli, my friend and former colleague or classmate from graduate school. His case became, a global cause célèbre because of his ties to the United States and the work we were doing on his behalf. We won his case at the UN. We had 112 members of Congress writing to President Bush, urging him to raise the case with Hu Jintao, which he did. And, at around the 2-year mark in this case, when his trial had finally come to a conclusion, in that case, he had been held for almost a year and a half incommunicado before he was even charged with a crime. The judge hadn't received his instructions to issue the ruling in the case, and a rather awkward moment occurred where my friend Yang Zhenli's defense lawyer was called privately into the judge's chambers. And at that point in the case, all that was left was for a verdict to be issued. And under Chinese law, a verdict is supposed to happen within 3 months of the end of the trial. And the end of the 3 months was coming to a close. either side had the right under Chinese law to ask for a 1-month extension. And the judge begged my client's lawyer to ask for the 1-month extension because he hadn't received instructions from Beijing as to how to rule. And, you know, to his credit, my friend's lawyer, a very courageous human rights lawyer in China, Mo Xiaoping, told the judge, "I'm sorry, no, you know, I'm not going to ask for an extension because, frankly, we don't want an extension. We don't believe that, you know, that Yang Zhenli is guilty of any offense, and we believe you should acquit him on all charges." But, you know, that's the kind of pressure that Chinese defense lawyers are put under in this kind of a system. And, you know, you had the ironic, you know, situation where it turned out in that case that they exceeded the time limit allowable under Chinese law for issuing a verdict because the executive branch of the Chinese government was split about what to do. And ultimately, they issued the verdict almost 5 months late.
That's quite extraordinary. Could you tell us a little bit more about what do the Charter 08 demand?
Sure. Well, so, I mean, Charter 08 was really, you know, as I said, modeled after the you know, Charter 77 of Czechoslovakia. You know, it's a manifesto that was originally signed by about 350 Chinese intellectuals, and now more than 10,000 people have signed it inside and outside the country. You know, the charter has a range of specific demands, which includes amending the Constitution to make clear that there are actual and real separation of powers, that there's an independent judiciary, that China would be a legislative democracy, that there'd be public oversight and control of public servants. It also enshrined a whole series of basic international rights that, you know, to bring the Chinese Constitution in line with international laws, so freedom of association, expression, assembly, religion. It also related to, you know, creating a formalistic sense, a capitalist system, which would include free markets and a protection of private property, you know, and, you know, even, you know, things such as, you know, financial and tax reform, national social security system. And also, I mean, one of the important provisions that was in there, which I think is critically important for the future of China, is creating in reality, an actual federal state system. Because, of course, in China, there are numerous ethnic minority areas that are sensitive. And, you know, in essence, this is a complete rethinking of the way that China is run today, which is a centralized, collective, you know, communist system that, in theory, in the Constitution, has the kinds of guarantees that I'm describing, but all of them are subject to the, you know, to the mandates of the central party.
Has any demands of the Charter 08 ever been fulfilled?
It wouldn't be fair to say that China is, you know, exclusively moving in a bad direction. I think one has to put this set of issues in the context of the broader situation in China. You know, the Chinese government has lifted 500 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years. That's an extraordinary achievement from a development perspective. You know, roughly 10% growth of their GDP annually, which again is also extraordinary. You know, my own view is that, you know, economic and political development don't need to be mutually exclusive. And unfortunately, the way that the Chinese Communist Party has run things is that these must be mutually exclusive endeavors. And so I think that this is the challenge of modern day China, which is how do they manage the demands of people to see more accountability in a system that is highly controlled and centrally run. You know, most of the demands of Charter 08 haven't even begun to be addressed. You know, they are making progress in certain areas. I mean, you know, there are areas in which the Chinese judicial system, when it comes to issues on the economic side, you know, the ability to sue, you know, a company in a private dispute in the judicial system, you know, today as compared to 20 years ago, we'll get you can have a much fairer shake at justice on those kinds of issues. You know, they've done a lot to reduce illegally prolonged detention. 100,000 people, this is as of, I guess, 5 to 10 years ago, were in illegally prolonged detention, right? Meaning, for example, you're charged with a crime and convicted and given, let's say, a 3-year sentence, and at year 4, you're still sitting in prison. And there were 100,000 examples of situations like this, not just overstaying your charge, your sentence, but even being held before trial for years and years and years without access to a court. And 100,000 of these situations have actually been fully resolved. Now, these are not politically sensitive in any way.
Please help me understand, how big is the Chinese opposition? how many people actually believe that the system should be changed?
I think that the numbers of protests in China, as I mentioned, is 120,000 plus. China today is radically different than when it began opening in 1979. I mean, you now have literally hundreds of millions of people with access to mobile phones. The Chinese are trying to block access to the internet and to prohibited sites, and they have an army, almost literally, of people monitoring internet traffic and blocking websites. But there are, of course, ways around the Great Chinese Firewall. And in the subsequent, forthcoming years, it's estimated that 300 million more people in China will have access to mobile phone and data services. So I think it's a losing battle for the Chinese Communist Party to think they can control access to information in the country going forward. If you look at Twitter or the Chinese equivalent, Facebook, and the range of social media online and how in Chinese are engaging on these issues, there is mass discontent with the one-party system and the way that it's being operated. And, people have been very smart over time to understand what the limits are of their capacity to organize and what they can say that will criticize the government and where it will cross lines. And for the Chinese, it's really about, are you organizing people collectively to stand up against a particular set of issues? And if it's more political in orientation rather than economic, you can get yourself into trouble very, very easily. Now China is requiring you, of course, to register by name before you're able to legally access the internet to be able to try to track what everybody is doing. Again, I think it's a losing battle. But China doesn't have a free press, and there's still extensive censorship of what's going on. If you tried to do a hashtag on the equivalent of Twitter, with Tiananmen in it, you'll never be able to tweet out the word Tiananmen. But people get around that by, using other language, disturbances in 1989, and these kinds of things.
Is the opposition in China organized in some way? In Poland in the 80s, we could label the opposition as solidarity.
Unfortunately, no. There are a lot of people who are part of the broader democracy movement in China, but the democracy movement in China and in exile, sadly, from where I sit, is very, very fractured. And Lucia Bo has been a unifying figure after winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010. But of course, he's a political theorist, not a political leader. Now, of course, political theorists can become political leaders in the future. But as of now, of course, he's in prison. His wife's under house arrest. And Charter 08 is kind of the consensus document that is really kind of the broader principles of the democracy movement enshrined in a single location. So if you say, what does the Chinese democracy movement broadly defined believe in? I think it's fair to say, although there are, of course, diverse perspectives across the political spectrum, that is a consensus-based document about how China should look in the future.
Can we say that the economic growth in China is the way to corrupt the society, to drag it away from political issues? Everyone wants to be richer, but they don't want to mess up with the system.
Well, I think it's interesting because China, as I mentioned, has 120,000 protests annually. The Chinese government allows these protests to happen. Of course, they could crack down on them at any time, and they're well aware that the one-party system has its flaws, including the fact that in a system that has one party, you're going to see extensive corruption. You're going to see a lack of capacity to have transparency and accountability and good governance. I think the real question for China from an economic growth standpoint is, they've been able for many years to sustain it. It is not the case, of course, that economic growth or economic opening will necessarily lead to political reform. But at a certain point in time, the problems of the one-party system will weigh it down, and I think that's coming to light in the last, let's say, decade, especially, where you've seen the privatization of state-run industries that has led to millions of people laid off of work without any compensation or retirement packages, which has led to mass social unrest. You've seen local mayors, who are corrupt, be victims of, mass movements in their towns to oust them from office. And it's very, very difficult if you're in a one-party system and you're trying to rule everything from Beijing, and you're in a country of 1.3 billion people, to give instructions across the country, even if you're a brilliant economist or mathematician or whatever the case might be, and actually have confidence that what you're demanding when it comes to economic reform is going to actually come to pass as it then gets translated to the local level. It's even more of a challenge, and it's a little awkward, and one of the most sensitive topics for of issues that the Chinese media can't cover is how, you've seen within Chinese government officials, family members of Chinese government officials become billionaires in the one-party system. And this gap between rich and poor is only growing exponentially over time.
Have you ever felt the pressure from Chinese government personally on you?
So far, no. And this is because I tend to be very careful when I go in and out of China, and I don't cross lines that will get myself and, more importantly, others into trouble. So, if I go into Beijing and I meet with foreign media and I talk to, international NGOs and to, various embassies there, then I basically am pretty unmolested. I assume that I'm not on a blacklist. I'm sure I'm on some kind of a watch list. I mean, my view is they'll probably just not let me in, deny me a visa or deport me at the point in which they decide that it's not worth the trouble. But I would never, for example, even though I know many and am indirectly in touch with people on the ground, I would never be in touch with someone directly in a sensitive situation, nor would I ever meet with somebody, in a sensitive situation, because I wouldn't want to put their lives at risk. There's a lot more risk to someone meeting me than there is for me myself. I mean, arresting a white American human rights lawyer who represents Lucia Bo, would be the kind of trouble that they just don't want.
Are you being followed in China?
Yeah, I'm confident of that. And in fact, I've been in hotel rooms where I very carefully track, just for my own amusement, I guess you might say, precisely where I put things and all that stuff. And I've come back to my room and found things moved around just a little bit, but enough that I noticed. So yeah, I'm confident that, my stuff gets searched, and that, I don't bring electronics with me to China because I assume that everything's going to get hacked into.
Okay, tell me now, why are you doing this?
That's what the Chinese Communist Party is probably wondering. So I actually have a great answer for you to that question. I actually like to thank Jiang Zemin, the former Chinese president, for becoming a human rights lawyer. And I'll just tell you a little story about that. I was at university in the United States when, in the fall of 1997, getting a master's degree, when Jiang Zemin announced that he would come and visit the United States. And he decided to come to my campus. At the time, I was getting a master's degree at Harvard University. And, I, at the time, was studying domestic policy issues. And a friend of mine who was Taiwanese asked me to come and learn about the protests that were going to be planned. And she explained to me that, Harvard was rolling out the red carpet for Jiang Zemin. And I didn't at the time have any objections to him coming and speaking at Harvard. But my objection was how he was going to do it. So he was going to basically travel to Harvard. The original plan was to travel to Harvard in his own totalitarian bubble. And by that, what I mean is he was going to come to campus, give a speech. The university had banned all protests from taking place on campus, and he wasn't going to take any questions. And to me, that was just fundamentally at odds with the view of any university, even Poland, the United States, or anywhere in the world, which it should be, bastions of freedom and free exchange of ideas. And so I got involved in organizing the protests against Jiang Zemin, and he came in the fall of 1997, and I was outside, of the building where he was being detained. Helpfully, it was held at the edge of campus. Of the 5,000 protesters we turned out, the largest protest at Harvard since the Vietnam War, we were, quite loud would be a fair way to describe it. And he was asked a question by the media, did you hear the protesters outside? And his response was to say, yes, I heard them, but they need to speak louder.
So it was Jiang Zemin who actually prompted you to become who you are.
Exactly. And so, to me, it was the experience in the protest, and it's probably less Jiang Zemin, although that was part of it, but more the people that I got to know through organizing the protests. I met, one of my classmates at the time was the first Tibetan to go to Harvard Law School, who ultimately got his PhD there, named Lobsang Sangay, who's now the prime minister in exile of the Tibetan Central Administration. And I got to know a lot of extraordinary people who had suffered a lot under the Chinese one-party system. And, when all was said and done, while it was great that we turned out all these protesters to stand up and, yell and scream about human rights in China, my conclusion looking back on it was that, we had really no effect at all on human rights inside China. And I decided at that based on that experience, that I was going to go to law school and I was going to study to become a human rights lawyer. And so it was, probably the most part would be because of the people that I met and what they had been through, and a desire to want to be able to help and have the tools to be able to help people like this. And then secondarily, it is not incorrect to say that in part, Jiang Zemin inspired me to become a human rights lawyer.
Does this career choice come with a prize? I mean, wouldn't you be better off if you were a lawyer for a corporation?
Yeah, I'm sure I would be better off financially. It wouldn't be nearly as fun. I did practice law at a large law firm, although my work was in the human rights field. I was helping companies invest in tough parts of the world and helping ensure that they complied with international human rights standards. I also have a range of other experiences in human rights more broadly. But my goal was to try to do well and do good. There's no doubt if I was exclusively a corporate lawyer and was out to just make a lot of money, I probably would have done much better financially. But as I said, I wouldn't be having so much fun.
Thank you very much for our conversation, Jared Genser, and good luck to you. This was Rafal Betlejewski of Polish Radio RDC in Warsaw, Poland. Bye.